Good evening. I'm Vicente Batts Jr., the Dean of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. On behalf of the McCain Institute, the Millikan Center, and the Cronkite School, I welcome you to our event tonight. Only one way forward, the vitality of a democratic Ukraine. Our event marks the official opening of the Relentless Courage, Ukraine and the World at War photojournalism exhibit here on our campus. Thanks to the generosity of the Ginsburg Family Foundation and the Blue Star Press, the Relentless Courage exhibit is available for ASU students and members of the community to view through December 2023. I'd like to acknowledge Mark McCain, President and CEO of the Ginsburg Family Foundation. And Michael Edgerton, editor of the Blue Star Press, who are with us tonight. We're looking forward to an engaging discussion this evening, and I'd like to introduce a couple of speakers. Dr. Evelyn Marcus, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. Evelyn.
Thank you very much, Dean Vicente. Dean Batts. I am the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. The McCain Institute is inspired by the legacy of the late Senator McCain and his family to boldly defend democracy, fight for human rights, and to create character-driven leaders. And so when the opportunity came to team up with Dean Batts and his colleagues to host this exhibit, we jumped at it. And we are deeply grateful to all of the people who made this possible. I want to thank the Ukrainian Embassy Ambassador Markalova. You will be hearing from her shortly, and her first secretary, Katya Shmagli, who was a McCain Global Leader. You can look it up at McCaininstitute.org, see what that is, but you will hear more from one of our McCain Global Leaders who is Ukrainian and is with us today, Maria Levchenko. In addition, I would like to add my thanks to Dean Batts, to Mark McCain from the Ginsburg Foundation. Thank you so much. We couldn't have done this without your support. Also to Michael Edgerton from the organization that published the book, as well as, the editor of the book, and then the publisher of the book also. And I commend the book to all of you. These images, as you saw, are shocking, they're penetrating, but they are as important as words on a page or a human explaining to you what happened, whether they were an eyewitness or not. These journalists were eyewitnesses, and they are an eyewitness to history. We brought this to you in Arizona because, of course, physically it's very far away, but it shouldn't be because it's very human. And the last thing I want to say, because if Senator John McCain were here, he would want to channel all his energy into reminding Americans that we are all in this grand experiment together. After World War II, we set up an international order. We set up rules. We said we don't want to have another global war. And so we set up the United Nations system that said, okay, states, we'll recognize your boundaries as long as within those states you recognize the human rights of people and you recognize one another's boundaries. There were very clear rules that were set up. Now, over history, we know that there have been wars and there have been violations of boundaries, but the way that Vladimir Putin executed this war against Ukraine started in 2014 has been completely throwing out the rule book. He went in and invaded and occupied Crimea. It was the first annexation since Adolf Hitler annexed Austria. Something shocking, and should have been more shocking to all of us, because the fact that we didn't, frankly, stop him then meant that we had to face what he did over a year, maybe not 2 years ago, when he launched a full frontal invasion of Ukraine and, frankly, an assault on the innocent people of Ukraine. Because make no mistake, this is not a war like what you think of traditionally, two armies fighting one another. Yes, there is trench warfare, and there is that kind of war. But the way the Russians are waging the war, they're waging it the way they waged war on the Syrian people with the Syrian government, the way they waged it in Chechnya. They are launching a war against innocent civilians with torture, with rape, with murder, with bombing civilian buildings, which is you saw in these photographs. So I know I've used a little more of my time, Dean Batts, but I wanted to really highlight how important it is that we stay with Ukraine, because with about 5% of the US defense budget, we have been able to eliminate about 50% of Russia's military power. And today, the number one risk, military risk to the United States and its allies in the world is Russia. Even though we have concerns about China, Russia is the number one threat. It wants to take down the international order. And so standing up to Russia in Ukraine is the right thing to do. It's also, frankly, less costly in money and in American lives to do it there than to have to face Vladimir Putin later. Because if he wins in Ukraine, he will not stop. He will go and he will challenge, he will take over Georgia and Moldova, former Soviet states, and then he will challenge NATO, because we're the only alliance to stand up to him. And dictators like him don't stop until they are met with firmness, until they are stopped. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for caring.
As Evelyn noted, we're also joined tonight by Maria Levchenko. Maria is a senior protection officer at the Center for Civilians in Conflict and Peace Building advisor at the Romanian Peace Institute. Thank you for being here. And two of our featured photojournalists are joining us virtually tonight, Carol Guzzi and Shvet Jacqueline, who I understand is joining us live from Ukraine. Also joining us tonight with a virtual greeting is Ambassador Oksana Marakova, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States. We will now have a greeting from the Ukrainian ambassador.
Dear President Trump, Dean Bates, Evelyn Farkas, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the opening of the truly moving photography exhibit, Relentless Courage, Ukraine and the World at War. We are deeply thankful to the McCain Institute and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications of Arizona State University for hosting this exhibit in Phoenix, Arizona. We are also grateful to the Ginsburg Family Foundation, whose contribution has made it possible for the ISU students, but also the broader Arizona community to engage with the compelling and timely stories of Ukraine's human suffering, portrayed by so many talented American, Ukrainian, and international photographers. This exhibit has a very special meaning to me. It is based on the Relentless Courage photo book. This book was put together by the Blue Star Press and its Relentless editor, Michael Edrington. With all his personal dedication and professionalism, Michael selected the best photos of Pulitzer Prize-winning photographers and photojournalists to remind the world of the high price Ukraine has paid in this war, the suffering and tragedies of unimaginable proportions. Ukrainian photographer Dmytro Kozatsky, whose photograph "A Light Will Win" has made it to the cover of the Relentless Courage photo book. He defended Mariupol for 90 days and then spent 4 months in Russian captivity. His photo, taken inside Azov steel plant, has become a symbol of Ukraine's courage and our resilience. I hope today's event will also serve as a potent reminder of what is at stake should Putin's lawless aggression continue. Let it serve as eternal tribute to the lost Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who gave their lives to protect Ukraine's sovereignty, freedom, and democracy, but also the democracy everywhere in the world. Many thanks to all of you for attending today's opening and standing with us during these trying times. We truly value the support of all American people, of the Biden administration, of the US Congress, on a very strong bipartisan basis, and all Arizonians for continuous ironclad support we Ukrainians feel as we continue defending our democracy and statehood from authoritarian brutal Russia. Together, we will win. Slava Ukraini.
Now we will engage in a discussion, and I'd like to invite Evelyn and Maria to please join me. So here at the Cronkite School, what we endeavor to do is to bring the stories that are happening globally, bring them to the people, bring them to our students, bring them to the community, to engage in a discussion about the affairs and the things that are happening globally and how they impact us. We cannot think of anything that is really more impactful and more timely than this particular story here. Just last week, President Zelensky was visiting the United States and actually met with President Biden and members of Congress for Ukraine in the war. The United States has already sent some $70 billion of aid to Ukraine in its effort against Russia in this war, and now there's a request for another $20 billion. So this discussion is very timely, and the discussion on whether to approve this request has now become part of the ongoing budgetary discussions in Washington. So we'll see where that leads. So starting off with that, Maria, you've got a lot of experience on the ground, what's happening in Ukraine. Someone who might want to understand why this is important, why don't you share what you're seeing and helping to understand what's going on in the country?
First, thank you for having me here. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit of what I see and what people experience on the ground. It's because of my job, I travel quite often to the front lines. I travel quite often to Sumy, to Kharkiv, to Poltava, to all the cities that being shelled and bombed every single day. And when I was looking at the pictures today, I was thinking that I have seen this with my own eyes. I have seen destroyed buildings. I have seen people who are crying. I have talked to them and they did share with me what's happening. So just to explain why this fight is important for us, I was in Trostenets, which was 40 days under Russian occupation. And I was there 2 months ago. And when I talk to the people and say, are you ready for peaceful negotiations? Would you be willing to negotiate with Russians? They say, we would better die than go back and experience what we have experienced again. So for many Ukrainians, this is not just the war that is raging out, where this is a fight for our survival, and this is genocide happening in front of our eyes. So for many of us, it's just a means for survival. That's why we are engaged in this fight day to day.
Evelyn, with the McCain Institute, you all's work is about democracy and supporting democracy throughout the world. When you think about what's happening in Ukraine, and as you pointed out in your opening remarks about how we don't stop Russia's aggression in Ukraine, that we're willing to stop. Kind of reiterate some of the points that you made about why this is a grave concern, why we, in your opinion, need to continue to have this support, and just what that's been like in terms of sharing that story and why this exhibit helps to bring that to the forefront of people's minds and understanding what's happening a world away and really bringing it home for them.
Yeah, I mean, I speak not so much from the human perspective. I think the journalist and Maya can speak more from the human, what they observed, but as a political scientist and as somebody who worked in President Obama's Pentagon and watched Vladimir Putin's evolution, his ideology, you know, we didn't fully understand what Vladimir Putin wanted. First, when he invaded the Republic of Georgia, which is a country that Russia occupies 20% of its territory. Many people don't even know that. He did that in 2008, and that was under the Bush administration. We didn't really fully comprehend the meaning of that. And then in 2014, when, as I mentioned, Putin went in and annexed Crimea and then started another war, started a hot war in Donbass, in another part of eastern Ukraine. we also didn't completely understand. We thought, well, okay, he wants to exert influence, control over Ukraine, but he doesn't, maybe he's not going to invade. But what happened was that his attempt to exert influence over Ukraine didn't work. And my assessment is the reason he conducted this full frontal invasion was because he thought that he would win. He was misled probably by his generals and by his intelligence officers. But what he wants is to create a new imperial Russia, the former Soviet republics, and he would like to exert influence on Eastern Europe, over the territory that the Soviet Union also exerted influence over. And there's no room for him in his version of the world for democracy. The Ukrainian people picked a different path in 2014 when they went to the streets. They said, we want to be like our Polish neighbors. We want to have an open, competitive, capitalist system and be free to say what we want to say, associate politically with the European Union and NATO eventually, maybe. And the Russians they prevented that. They wanted to prevent it. They won't prevent it. And the reality is that Ukraine will not be under Russian control ever again, but there's a difficult process now for them to actually rebuild and fully obtain their independence. And we have to make sure that happens because, again, as I said, Vladimir Putin won't stop. He is determined to also control those other countries. And he does not want democracy on his doorstep, and he does not want the United States telling him what to do. And the last thing I'll say about this Pinto is that we tend to think, oh, those bad guys, why don't we just do our own thing here and maybe they won't bother us? But the reality is that the United States is the #1 political, economic, and military power. The bad guys are afraid of us. They know we're the only ones that can stop them from oppressing smaller states and smaller peoples. And so they want to make sure the United States is not there to speak out for the human rights of other people in democracies and non-democracies, and to speak out for the right of people to choose democracy.
Maria, this issue has, become somewhat politicized here in the States. We're, if you haven't heard, we're very politically divided here in the country right now at this particular time. And so this issue about whether or not to continue to support Ukraine has become part of that. What would you say to someone who says that why should the United States support Ukraine in this effort?
Well, because first of all, this war really creates ripple effects that touch upon not only Ukraine, the European Union, but across the whole world. And believe me or not, you can feel it everywhere. This May, I was working with South Sudanese refugees in Uganda, whose food rations have been cut because of the war in Ukraine. The World Food Program has been cutting what they have been receiving. And this is the war, we really believe that this is a third world war. Somehow people don't feel it, don't understand it, but it is happening right now in front of our eyes. And if the support for Ukraine doesn't continue, as Dr. Evelyn was already sharing, this will touch upon other countries as well. And this will create really a disaster for the whole world.
Evelyn, I propose that question to you as well. What would you say to someone you're in Washington quite a bit, get to interact a lot with political leaders? What would you offer to someone who says to you, why should we continue to support Ukraine?
Well, I think it's everything that I said before, that it could become existential for us if we don't support Ukraine today, because the part left out is, of course, that Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, they're all interfering already in our politics through social media, through the internet. And they would like to see an America that doesn't stand up for democracy, which has very real significance. We should understand that that's a challenge to our way of life. It's a challenge to our economic system. It's a challenge to the rule of law in America that protects all of us, whether we're journalists on the screen or business people or academics.
I want to go to the journalists who are joining us virtually and just pose a few questions to them. I'll start off with you, Carol. So what has it been like as a photojournalist to see what's going on the ground and to gather these images and then report them back?
Well, it's true. It's not a traditional war between soldiers on a battlefield at all, from my experience. It's literally daily terrorism for the most vulnerable civilians, and to document that, the endless random shelling and innocent victims in this war was beyond horrifying. And we're supposed to be objective as journalists, of course, and accurately report the best we can, visually or with words. But I think we also have to amplify voices of justice. And I feel that it's not a war, it's terrorism. And I'm afraid someday, generations from now, years from now, we'll look back and wonder how the world could have allowed this to go on so long, and why there's not a mechanism in place, perhaps in our species at this point in time, that we haven't evolved enough that something like this can't be stopped before there's so much suffering and so much pain. The people themselves, the spirit, the resilience of the Ukrainian people was just humbling and inspiring every day. Everyone I met, I wasn't covering the front lines. I was with the humanitarian side, the civilians, the whole time I was there last year. I was there for probably 6 months out of the year last year, and I think they're very savvy also about a free press and the power of the press. They're fighting for freedom, democracy, and some might say humanity itself. And I think they understand our role in documenting this war and fighting propaganda and showing the world the reality of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And people actually would come up to me and say, thank you for doing my job. And that to me was so touching, because a lot of times I'm called an enemy of the people back here in the States. So, and it happened over and over and over again. So it was, that was refreshing. But witnessing the spirit, as I said, was humbling, but having to document such horror was, it's haunting still. Every day it haunts me.
What might you add to that?
Hi. Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't know if there's a ton to add to what Carol said in terms of covering the war initially. I can add to, what I'm seeing every day now. And currently I'm in Odessa, and last night we had one of the largest attacks that we've had. And all of the attacks have been specifically on grain infrastructure and civilian residences, which are both things that do not speak to a military initiative of this war and do impact a global population. So, I think that it's really important to not just see the photos that have been taken, but understand that these are the expressions that people are wearing every single day. These events are happening every single day, and that a single photograph represents the daily life of every Ukrainian here who is, still fighting to survive.
So one of the things that we endeavor to do is to try to present all sides of an issue so that we can understand all perspectives. Can either of you talk about how difficult it has been to report this from the Russian perspective of what's going on? Carol, I'll pose it to you.
Ideally, yes, I would. I wish that there would be more coverage of the Russian side. I don't think we have that opportunity, and I think it's very unfortunate. And I also, militarily, certainly there's one aspect, but it would be, it would be valuable to know what the Russian people really understand or know about this war, how they truly are feeling. I think it's so censored that we have no idea of that side. And certainly this is probably one of the most covered wars in our lifetime. We have cameras and reporters and so many journalists on the ground in Ukraine covering just about every aspect of, the complicated puzzle that is Ukraine right now. But there's no balance of having the Russian voice, which I believe ideally we should have if we could.
Any perspective there in terms of reporting from the Russian side of what's happening on the ground?
No, I mean, I would just say, I guess, that as the occupied territories are collected by Russian forces, they are then attempting to move populations of their own people into these spaces and quickly reclaim these areas. They're starting currencies and governments and trying to erase the Ukrainian identity as quickly as possible. And I hope that there is insight into those experiences if there's not insight into what's happening in Russia itself, because this is now a territory that is being re-identified. And there are still so many Ukrainians that are being affected that can add to the story of what is happening on the Ukrainian side. I think that any journalist you talk to would say that they would hope that there's some sort of press that is able to come out and better explain what's going on.
So there's been a fair amount of misinformation that's been spread about what's happening in the war. Evelyn, and then Maria as well. Explain the role of journalism in helping to provide an understanding and cutting through misinformation, and how journalists have stepped up to confront that, because confronting that propaganda is part of this whole thing that's happening. And there's a lot of misinformation that's in the system, but talk about the role of journalism as a pillar of democracy and why it is so very important in times like this.
Well, I think Maria has a lot of insight into how it affects the war. So I'll just say quickly from the U.S. context, because of the McCain Institute, we also do have some programs focused on American democracy and misinformation and disinformation, or the task force, as you know, that we are co-leading. What we find is that the best antidote to misinformation and disinformation is having journalists that people know. So having local journalists and having journalists that people trust because they know them as individuals. And in the United States, we've lost a lot of that local journalism. So all of you guys doing university journalism, that's really good preparation for doing local journalism, and then of course national journalism. So that's one aspect of it. But clearly we also need to have civic education. We need to teach people to be better consumers.
I think that propaganda has played a crucial role in this hybrid war since 2014, when Russia has been seeing lies about how Ukrainians are bombing Donetsk. But if you compare pictures from Donetsk right now and pictures of Mariupol, you will see a big difference in how Ukraine is bombing the city and what Russians did to occupy Mariupol. For us, of course, propaganda still plays a huge role, and if any of you speak Russian or have opportunity to read Russian newspapers, I highly encourage you to do so, just to try to understand how propaganda really works in practice. Because when you read those stories, they are always trying to play on a human component. They are telling these stories how Russian soldiers are saving Ukrainians who are being abused by Ukrainian army, by Ukrainian soldiers. And of course, most of the people in Russia tend to believe that. So for us, we're trying to fight the propaganda, but of course it's super hard since we don't have access to Russia or the people who are on occupied territories, since their connection is being cut and they don't have access to it. I personally have relatives in Crimea who also read newspapers and Russian media, and they truly believe that Ukraine is bombing our own cities. This is what has been on their media quite often.
Okay. Now we're about halfway through our program. We want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions of our panelists and our photojournalists who are joining us from Ukraine. But again, I'm excited about us having the opportunity to have this exhibit and to have this discussion, because at the Cronkite School, where we are, what we endeavor to be is to engage globally and to bring these global issues, these global stories home. Because a lot of times we can think about what's happening in our community, what's happening right here in Phoenix, and really not be connected to what's happening around the world. But this world is interconnected. And as we've discussed, what happens elsewhere does impact what's happening here. So again, we've got about 30 minutes left. We'd like to have questions from the audience. So please, we have the microphone here. Please come up and just state who you would like to pose your question to. We'll do our best to answer.
Am I allowed to ask Maria a question? What would be the most helpful thing that Americans do?
It's a question that I always get asked at all the conferences. I think keep supporting Ukraine. I understand that many people right now feel like they're tired. They don't want to spend money anymore. Many are saying, but Ukrainians are so united. There is so much solidarity with you guys, keep going. But it's really hard for us to hear thoughts and prayers and not to receive any other support. And I don't want to be myself begging right now for support. But without your support, we will not survive this war, unfortunately. We didn't have enough weapons, we didn't have enough rockets, we didn't have enough anything. And we are fighting and we are paying with our lives for this freedom. So if you can keep at least raising awareness, this is something that Ukraine really needs right now.
We're going to go back to our photojournalists, and either of you all can sort of take this. I'll give it to you, Svet, first. Describe your worst day as a journalist on the ground, and what that was like, and how it really impacted your perspective, and where you really felt as though your work was most impactful.
My worst day on the ground. I can't say a specific day. I would say that, being in Bucha was pretty tough. I think it was tough for all of us as journalists, just because of the amount of genocide that we had to witness. It was also sort of the first time in this war that we were able to really see what was happening behind enemy lines. Until that point, there was really no understanding of what Russia was doing to the Ukrainian civilian population. And, when we arrived in these previously occupied cities that were surrounding the capital, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to see that this was possible in this day and age, that we haven't learned from our past mistakes as humans, and that this was really what Russia was coming to do here in this country. It was so destructive and so terrible as they pulled body after body out of the mass grave. I think that for me, it really changed my understanding of what war can look like and the evil that war is, as it was my first exposure to conflict in my professional career as a journalist. For me, it changed everything, and it really presented itself as a modern day genocide. Carol?
I agree. Bucha was horrifying. We literally were witnessing war crimes. We had a front row seat to war crimes, and we were documenting it. And I think it's critically important that every photograph, every word written about what's happening right now in Ukraine will be historically important. And also, of course, day by day, the fact that it's going on, as Svet said, over and over and over. I mean, we take pictures and we try to show what it's like to be there, but I don't know if people really understand what it's like, that fear, that uncertainty, that never feeling really safe because the randomness of the shelling and the brutality is just, it's so pervasive. And I was desperately frightened when I was there, and I can only imagine. I mean, I can get on a plane and leave, and I can only imagine what it's like to just be there day in and day out. And I think Ukrainians, to their credit, living with joy and hope almost seems to be an act of defiance to the war. And to their credit, it's pretty amazing to witness that kind of spirit also in light of the brutality that's happening to them.
Ellen, you obviously know the McCain family very well. What would John McCain say about this morning?
Oh my God, he would be really angry. When he gets passionate, he's usually angry. When he's passionate, when he feels like something's happening that's not just. I mean, he would agree with what Carolyn Svet said. He would be calling this a genocide. He would be exhorting our government to call it a genocide. He would be doing all the things that many of my colleagues and myself have done, writing and speaking out in favor of more arms to Ukraine, faster, better, longer range, giving them better air cover. Our government has provided a lot, but there's always more, and it can be done faster. And we have had a tendency to fear escalation on the part of Vladimir Putin, when in fact we see that escalation usually results in nothing. He thought it was he indicated that if Ukrainians used weapons against Crimea, that something would happen, maybe a nuclear weapon would be used. And guess what? The Ukrainians did it, and there was no nuclear weapon. It's not in Vladimir Putin's interest to launch a nuclear assault on Ukraine or anywhere in the world, for a whole host of reasons that I can get into, but we don't have time. And he can't do it by himself anyway. So John McCain would be saying that this is about humanity. This is the journalist said it really well. Like, we should have learned by now as humans to not do this to one another. And yes, it's not the only place it's happened. But clearly, we should have done more in Syria. We should have done more probably in Chechnya. There are a lot of places. Myanmar, the Rohingya experienced genocide not that long ago, and people in the world hasn't stopped it. There's been so far impunity for those attacks on civilians and genocides, and because of that, Vladimir Putin has continued launching this war against innocent civilians. So John McCain would say we have to end this era what David Miliband, the head of the International Refugee Committee, calls the age of impunity. No more impunity. We must get accountability. And one last thing, because I'm going soon with this Ukraine Business Alliance, we have companies, not just people who are citizens helping Ukrainians by raising money and sending money and supporting our government, our members of Congress who support Ukraine. But we also have companies that are doing pro bono work, Microsoft, and some of them are also getting paid. Palantir Defense Company. We have Skylink, SpaceX. These are private companies that recognize that what's happening in Ukraine is really important because it's about democracy, the rule of law, freedom, and they want to help our government help Ukraine. And so I think John McCain would be applauding those companies, and he would be calling on all of us to do our duty. And he would definitely be giving the Biden administration and his colleagues in Congress a hard time and telling them they're not doing enough.
We have a question.
Yeah, my name's Thomas. My question's kind of for everyone in the panel. Like, how do you envision this war ending? Because I feel like a lot of people who are skeptical about continuing to fund it don't see an end in sight. And I see that perspective because a lot of people, including mine and myself, wonder what Putin would do if his back was really up against the wall. And I wonder if Putin would allow himself to just lose to Ukraine without firing off a nuclear weapon. Because a lot of people like Hitler, and Hitler had a very apocalyptic view of Germany and pretty much if I can't have Germany, he wants no one to have Germany, which is why he pretty much let Germany be destroyed. So a lot of people have that similar fear with Putin. And if his back's against the wall, like he could do something really dangerous, which would cause significant escalation. So I guess my question is like, how do you envision the war ending?
Yeah, I'll answer it first as a political scientist and then give the Ukrainian the actual last word on that question. So just quickly, first of all, Vladimir Putin is destroying Russia right now. This war that he is waging against Ukraine, make no mistake, it's completely destroying Russia. It's destroying them culturally. It's destroying the men of Russia, and I would say young men, except that he's taking middle-aged men and sending them to the fight. He's destroying already what was a very corrupt economy and with very little innovation or zero practically innovation. He's destroying the soul of Russia, of Russians. Now, granted, I would, and many political scientists would argue that Russia never came to terms with its imperial past, which is why we are where we are today. Because one of the things that I think we would do ourselves as a service is if we could explain to people that this is also neo-imperial, that this is not the first attempt by Russia to control and take over Ukraine. So, but Vladimir Putin, again, doesn't have the ability to launch a nuclear war by himself. It requires military apparatus. He has to give the command. And if he escalated to nuclear, even just a demonstration detonation, he knows that that's a risk he cannot calculate. The next day, President Biden has already warned him publicly and privately that there will be consequences. I'm pretty sure he said, and having been in the government before, I know what the playbook usually is. At a minimum, we will not use nuclear weapons, nuclear force, but we will use conventional force against Russia proper, against any sites, any places that have anything to do with any nuclear use. Of course, that would result in more nuclear release. So there are very clear warnings to Putin that he doesn't know what the next day will look like, and it's not going to look good for him. And likely he will lose power. There will also be actual fallout on Russians, which maybe he doesn't care about, but on some level, even a dictator needs some kind of legitimacy among their people. And he would lose legitimacy among the elites. He would lose it among the people. So I do not believe that he would escalate to nuclear. Could he escalate in some other way? Maybe. But frankly, I just can't imagine the war getting that much worse. And with every day that goes on that we are worried about him escalating, Ukrainians are losing their lives.
I'll just briefly recognize that he will not go to that extent of using nuclear weapons. Ukrainians shall never say after the end of the war, we always say after victory, because we are hopeful and we believe that this will be our victory. I also think that Putin has too many oligarchs around him who value themselves, their lives and businesses too much to allow him to use nuclear weapons. And this is actually that power that can be used by our allies is to put more sanctions on Russia. Because until every single regular citizen of Russia will feel the effects of the war on themselves, this war will not end. So the more sanctions on Russia, the faster it will end.
So a couple of other questions. Yes. Hi, my name is David. I'm not sure really who to ask this to specifically, but one issue that could potentially slow aid to Ukraine is that when there aren't any major military breakthroughs for a while, we see the emergence of fatigue among the American public. How can we preempt this and keep the American public motivated even as the war stands to or slows to a crawl?
Okay, well, I did work in Congress and then I ran unsuccessfully for Congress. But all kidding aside, we do need to keep reminding people, exhibits like this one. I mean, this is a way to bring home what's at stake. Do you want somebody who will go in and just obliterate apartment buildings, rape and kill children, take civilians hostage, tie their hands behind their backs, as you saw, and just murder them, torture them first? Do you want that happening anywhere in the world? You have to stop people like Vladimir Putin, because if he gets away with it, the other part, geopolitically speaking, is that other countries will take notice. And we know that China would like to, yes, if they can peacefully reintegrate Taiwan, but if they can't, they are willing to use force. They've said it, they're preparing for it. We don't want to encourage any other leaders to try these tactics. We said after World War II, never again. We passed the Geneva Conventions. We failed, of course, even before this. We have to stand up because this is so blatant. It's being filmed in front of our eyes. It's in Europe again, where World War I and World War II happened, and we said it wouldn't happen again. So we have a responsibility as humans to stand up to this regime and to make sure that this foreign policy is defeated. And therefore, that we need to defeat Russia and this aggressive foreign policy in Ukraine.
Next question.
Hello, thank you for speaking with us today. My question, you can go to anyone on the panel if they know more, but is directed to them really terrible names, but from the McCain Institute. And I don't know if you know very much terminology to like properly ask the question, but I was curious with U.S. policy towards Ukraine and money that we're spending to help them fight in the war effort. Like how much of that money, like even like a percentage and what is used for like humanitarian efforts? And I don't even know what that would look like. So I was wondering like how much that money is spent on humanitarian efforts and what are those humanitarian efforts and what else could we do even more of for that? And I asked that just because I completely understand the need for weapons to fight a war. But I guess something that always I think about when I say like, yeah, I support that and that's something that we need to give them. It also comes with the caveat of being like, it's violent, it's terrible, war is terrible. So I guess it just helps me kind of think like, okay, if we're spending some of this money, some of my taxpayer dollars are also being used for helping people who are suffering through a terrible situation. I would like to know more about that and what we're doing. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I'll also let Maria speak because she's probably more expert on this than I am. But since you directed it towards me, I'll start. So first of all, I also should commend much of our American news media, CNN, MSNBC. They have reporters out there, and CNN has them. I mean, they haven't left, and they're in the trenches, and they're very brave journalists covering this day in and day out. So I want to make sure that we recognize that today, because we want to encourage them to keep doing it because they bring that. I mean, I'm biased because they ask me to come on CNN almost every day. They ask me, but also on MSNBC quite often. But so that's really important. I would say that when you ask people, the Ukrainians, even those who are giving out food in Ukraine, what can you do for them? They all say, give us weapons because they want the fighting to stop. They want to stop being attacked. So for them, it's the weapons first. We have provided, as I said, about 5% of the U.S. defense budget, and I don't have the dollars in front of me in terms of how much we provided. It's into the Dean gave some information about that, but in addition to that, we have provided billions of dollars together with the European Union, with our European allies, to help the Ukrainian economy. Because it's very important that while this war goes on, the Ukrainian government can continue to function and provide services, transportation, whatever it is. Obviously in conflict areas, it's a little different, but you have to try to provide government services, pensions, et cetera. So we help make sure that the government itself can function, can stay financially solvent. In addition to that, there are private organizations. Howard Buffett is in there doing reconstruction during the war, just to call on one nonprofit, philanthropist. There are companies donating as well. But Maria, maybe you can speak more to this than I can.
Yeah, we see a lot of support on that as well happening over the last year. The problem is we also see decrease in the levels of humanitarian assistance coming into Ukraine. On the ground, I have been personally in Chernihiv, where many buildings have been destroyed. And right now, NGOs are fighting who's going to put the windows inside those buildings. But they have been fighting for the last 6 months, and people are without windows still and without any glass. So it shows there are some issues. There are issues in how the NGOs are coordinating the money that they are receiving through the donors. And as I said, the levels are decreasing. So we need to raise awareness on that issue as well.
Thank you for your answers. It was very helpful.
And I left out USAID. I don't know the numbers either. State Department. There's a lot of humanitarian assistance going on, but maybe not perfectly administered.
Thank you.
No time for one more question.
And one last thing, I think diplomacy is important. Maria talked about sanctions, but there's also the diplomatic isolation. Vladimir Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. I mean, the last person who was indicted, now I'm going to forget, but this is a serious thing. He could not travel to South Africa. He could not come to the UN meeting. There's a warrant out for his arrest. Sorry, he's not indicted. There's a warrant out for his arrest for kidnapping and stealing Ukrainian children, bringing them to Russia and forcing them into adoption. And that's just one war crime. That's the one that was the easiest one for them to basically put together a case on. But the Ukrainian prosecutor general every day is working on. Last time we saw him, he said like 35,000 cases. The technology companies that the McCain Institute is working with, they're also helping on that because Ukrainian people are reporting many, many crimes, and it's almost overwhelming for the Ukrainian prosecutors, but they're going to do their best to make sure everybody gets justice.
Thank you very much. My name is Oля Johnson. I am a Ukrainian first degree immigrant that immigrated here 20 years ago. Now I am a volunteer with a local organization that is called Cactus and Thistle. And first of all, a statement. Thank you very much for every single journalist. Thank you very much for every single future journalist for what you do. If not for you, we would have become Syria, another Syria. Syria will continue. No one talks about that. And we would have become another Syria. So thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So many thoughts, so many questions and answers. Propaganda. Russian propaganda, it is active, it is horrifying, it is ghettos level propaganda in Russia, in Russian occupied territories. But this propaganda exists here. For example, as volunteers, as a powerful volunteer, we're going for the third time in October to All Ukrainian Action Summit, when we meet with all our representatives, all our senators from all 52 states, and we walk on the legislature, and we Lobbying is not the right word, and we ask him to help. Some of the biggest issues is here with Arizona and constituents is propaganda that is happening here. For example, we were talking about military. Yes, we talked about that, but we are not knowing, and it is not known for the public knowledge, that out of 60% of military aid provided to Ukraine is staying within the United States. Let's talk about artillery and shells. This is going to Ukraine, but we are recycling and reusing the old artillery. We are not using brand new, and while that is happening, the American factories are starting to produce new artillery to substitute. This is the subtle tone of propaganda that is being used here in the United States, But, and my question is how we here volunteers can fight this subtle Russian misconcept propaganda. It's not a lot. It is half truth, half small. How can we fight here in the local on American land with this propaganda? Again, we're grassroots, we do not have huge funding, we just are acting for our money. Thank you.
Okay, just very quickly, and maybe Carol's back in the States, so she might have ideas too. I think you have to try to elevate the conversation and say, okay, even whatever it is, if there's some truth in what they're saying, but remember the big truth. The big truth is that Russia is waging a war against innocent people, against children, women, men who are not waging war. So this is not the little things that they raise, the objections that they raise, they're not as valid as if you can raise it to the higher level. So for example, with the financial objection in the United States, they'll say, well, shouldn't we spend our money on something else? But again, if you look at the US military budget and what the US national security strategy is oriented towards, our number one immediate threat is Russia. So if that's our number one immediate threat, leaving aside the China challenge, which is linked, because if Russia gets away with something like this, China will be emboldened to be even more threatening to us. So with a small amount of money, which yes, actually helps the American economy because we are producing. And one of the things that we were talking about at a recent conference in Tbilisi, Georgia, that we co-host with our Eastern European colleagues was, can we go and thank those people in Ohio who are manufacturing weapons for Ukraine? Because we Eastern Europeans, and now these are people from Lithuania, Latvia, et cetera, we are so grateful to those Americans. But those Americans are benefiting from their jobs. So I think there are arguments to be made, and you don't engage in whatever this piece of disinformation is, take it away, take it up, and show the better positive picture. But you're right, part of it is also that many Americans, hyphenated American, or people from different origins, so Russian Americans or Ukrainian Americans, they are also sometimes watching Russian media. And so there are people in America who are just as susceptible and brainwashed by that. And then there are American, and frankly, this is going to sound political, but I don't see them as much on the far left or at all. On the far right, you have people who use the same arguments that the Kremlin uses, and they talk to each other on the internet. And so the disinformation is also Russian disinformation that creeps into our rhetoric, our political bloodstream, because our politicians pick up on it, and whether they know it or not, they're actually helping.
Yes, I can agree. Part of the conversations with our politicians, many of them, I understand, I agree, but I cannot do anything because my constituents are listening to different media, and they will call me the next day. I cannot vote against it.
Maybe the journalists also have something on that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. There's such an echo. I couldn't understand most of that conversation.
The question was about disinformation in the United States. So what do you say when somebody tries an argument against assistance for Ukraine, pulling out some kind of Russian disinformation argument?
Well, I mean, as a journalist, the only thing we can do is continue to report. I mean, I think any story like this that goes on for a long time, there's compassion fatigue, and then there's a lot of voices coming up specifically with Ukraine for still supplying aid, all the millions of dollars, billions of dollars. It could go to other places. But I don't think, I think the bigger picture, this is such a profound, epic story, and it's so vital on so many levels that we engage and we continue to help Ukraine. Personally, that's my personal opinion, because it has ramifications that are worldwide. And if we allow this kind of aggression to take place, I mean, where is it going to go next, as you said? And I think people are becoming weary of the war, and it's our job, it's our challenge to continue to engage them, continue to raise awareness, do stories that are maybe a little bit different, that they're not expecting, anything to bring light back onto what the reality of the day-to-day living in Ukraine and what's happening in this, I hate to even call it a war. It's literally, terrorism on a daily basis that people are living, and it's one long war crime and a slow genocide that's happening, and it's profound. So I think the naysayers, it's our job just to keep showing people, keep pounding them over the head with these stories and pictures and visuals and the reality of the day-to-day life in Ukraine and what it could mean for the world, depending how this story ends.
Thank you. Well, this will conclude our event this evening. I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to thank our panelists, Ellen, Maria, thank you so much. Sven, Carol, thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe there on the ground, and we appreciate your work. I encourage you all to share information about our exhibit. We will have the exhibit here at the Conkai School through December. So please invite others to come and see it. Our building is open, and so we want people to see this exhibit. That's why we're very happy to be able to host it. We appreciate the work of the university helping to make this happen and our sponsors as well. So thank you all very much.